Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I think that this is a wonderful opportunity we have provided by the Nuremberg Principles Academy to discuss Agenda 2030 and the achievements, challenges, and progress made in implementation, but also future prospects for the promotion of human rights development and ICL. The 2030 Agenda, we know, is an international political commitment adopted by all member states of the UN in 2015. It comprises 17 Sustainable Development Goals, 169 targets, and more than 200 indicators. The 2030 Agenda is grounded on human rights. As you know, that its predecessor, the first Millennium Development Goals, did not have a single reference to the words human rights, and this was not accidental. The rights language was strenuously resisted by states who preferred to treat economic goals as aspirations. So it took much effort as civil society actors, concerned states, and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which I headed then, to push for the inclusion of human rights into the language of the SDGs. So the agenda now explicitly recognizes its foundation on human rights principles and instruments, requiring that its implementation be in accordance with human rights. It also endorses the cross-cutting human rights principles of equality and non-discrimination, of universality, interdependence, indivisibility, accountability, and participation. Moreover, an important number of goals and targets reproduce or are directly inspired by existing human rights, not only in the field of economic, social, and cultural rights. So these are goals and targets on poverty eradication, the right to food, health, education, water and sanitation, decent work, and sustainable cities. But they're also on equality, SDG 5 and 10, and on civil and political rights, SDG 16 and 17, and an array of targets also coincide with obligations of international cooperation and assistance with components of the right to development. The agenda is further remarkable for being the first global agreement, in contrast to the MDGs, that explicitly recognizes governance and civil and political rights as a dimension of sustainable development. And as I cooperated with civil society to push for the inclusion of these rights, I recall citing Mandela's famous words on delivering on bread and ballot in support of the inclusion of this right. The cardinal principle of the 2030 Agenda, as Klaus Rackwitz reminded us, is to leave no one behind, which is directly inspired in the human rights principle of equality and non-discrimination, and also reflects the underlying rationale of socio-economic rights. Namely, the state has a positive duty to take priority action towards those who are in a vulnerable situation. Now, the huge disparities in wealth that we see all over the world between rich and poor is an affront to the principle of equality. Rights to education, health, housing, water, and sanitation are not commodities for sale only to those who can afford to pay, but should be accessible to all. And as we look around, unfortunately, that's how it is, including in my own country. You don't have access to health or education unless you have money, and justice as well, if you can afford to pay your lawyers. So measures oriented to achieve development goals should be compliant with human rights norms and standards. And this means that development-based measures should do no harm, should comply with adequate procedural safeguards, and should follow the principles of equality and non-discrimination, of meaningful participation of those affected by the measures, transparency, and accountability. And as we know, the private sector is also bound by human rights responsibilities, as the agenda makes clear that the involvement of the private sector in the achievement of the SDGs should be in line with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which was adopted by the Human Rights Council. Now, the SDGs are not a sequel or an extension of the Millennium Development Goals. They are a new blueprint of fresh ideas, initiated and to be monitored by governments, not by UN specialists involving developed and developing countries. So given their substantial convergence, SDGs and human rights can be mutually reinforcing. Implementation of human rights obligations can enhance the achievement of the SDGs, and in turn, the 2030 Agenda might give better visibility, reaffirm the commitment to human rights, and offer concrete benchmarks, targets, and a time frame against which the progressive realization of civil, economic, social, and cultural rights could be measured. Now, this brings me to the identification of synergies between international criminal law, ICL, and Agenda 2030. It may have appeared to those working in silos and with tunnel vision. You can guess who I'm referring to. The UN agencies always operated in silos. Development people hated the human rights people, so those are the inner fights to get the UN to have a common vision. So those who work within that tunnel vision may well see ICL as having no role or no influence on development and human rights. So I looked at what the late Sheriff Bassioni wrote almost 30 years ago on the 5 stages of evolution of human rights protection. And he says first there's the enunciative stage, the shaping of internationally perceived shared values. Secondly, the declarative stage, and that involves the incorporation in international instruments. Thirdly, prescriptive stage, the elaboration in binding international conventions, creating obligations on the part of states. Fourth, enforcement stage, developing modalities of enforcement. And finally, fifth, the criminalization stage, the development of international penal proscriptions. Now, the inadequacies of the modalities for implementation compelled the protected right into a prohibited crime. And thus, Bassioni concludes that, I quote him, ICL is the ultima ratio modality of enforcing internationally protected human rights. ICL is the response when there is a crisis in implementation of internationally protected human rights. The world of international relations also evolved dramatically so that the public and private international law that we all knew, well, people of my age knew, then acquired fresh labels in your lifetime, and that is international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and international criminal law. And it would not surprise anyone that they all have a great deal in common, namely the protection of human rights. As we all know, at Nuremberg in 1945, judicial power backed by punishment was exercised on behalf of the international community. And progress since then has been very recent, but steady, with the establishment by the UN Security Council of the ad hoc criminal tribunals for former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, followed by several hybrid courts, and culminating in the International Criminal Court in 2002. It would be true to say that the past 30 years has seen more rapid growth in accountability mechanisms than any time since the inception of the Nuremberg Tribunal. International law increasingly plays a role in shaping state policy and domestic law in advancing protection and promotion of human rights. International law is norm-based. It embodies human rights, democracy, and good governance, and the rule of law. I thought I'll pause here to examine what is rule of law, because we use the term so loosely. Growing up in apartheid South Africa, we were told that apartheid was the rule of law. It was not, but we were not allowed to say so. So by rule of law, we do not mean rule by law, and we do not mean law and order. Rule of law, and this is the way human rights people regard it, rule of law is a principle of governance in which all persons, institutions, and entities, public and private, including the state itself, are accountable to that which was publicly promulgated, equally enforced, and independently adjudicated, and which are consistent with international human rights norms and standards. It requires as well measures to ensure adherence to the principle of supremacy of law, equality before the law, accountability to the law, fairness in the application of the law, separation of powers, participation in decision-making, legal certainty, avoidance of arbitrariness, and procedural and legal transparency. So I thought it was important to understand what rule of law means, because it is so integral to getting equality in the development goals. Now, if we add to this trend of rule of international law the emergence of ICL and its emphasis on the criminal responsibility of the individual, and its emphasis on the end to impunity for the most serious crimes against humankind, the lesson is clear. Accountability for serious human rights violations by state and non-state actors is integral to the maintenance of international peace, security, and development. Agenda 2030 is an outcome of the heightened awareness that peace, justice, and development are interrelated and interdependent. There can be no sustainable development without peace and justice, and there can be none of these three without adherence to the rule of law. An end to impunity by accountability for serious human rights violations and international crimes is a critical component of equitable justice, as failure to address impunity jeopardizes the prospects of achieving sustainable peace and development and increases the risk of resurgence of conflict. And it is also clear that all human rights are in jeopardy during armed conflict. I was talking with Mr. Ramcharan, he's one of our speakers today. He's one of the early supporters of the relevance of human rights in the Security Council agenda. And you'll be surprised to know that the High Commissioner for Human Rights were not allowed to address the Security Council. And I heard that my predecessor, Louise Arbour, was asked to leave the Security Council when the Secretary General took her in, and she was told this is not the place for human rights. It's there in Geneva. So in my time, I said to the Security Council, how can you deliver on your mandate of peace, security, and development if you don't hear about the human rights issues? Because human rights violations are alerts to conflicts that are coming. And of course, it was in the context of Syria. So I addressed them 15 or 16 times. And so I'm really saddened that my successor, Prince Zayed, was not allowed to address the Security Council. So we really are going through troublesome times here. Let me move on to Sustainable Development Goal 16 on peace, justice, and strong institutions. This is an acknowledgement that sustainable development is not possible without access to justice for all, and effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. The UNDP reports that the interrelated impacts of violence, conflict, and crime divert trillions of dollars from development efforts and deny billions of people their full human rights. Without peace, stability, human rights, and effective governance based on the rule of law that I defined, we cannot hope for sustainable development. Some regions of the world enjoy sustained peace, security, and prosperity, while others fall into seemingly endless cycles of conflict and violence. High levels of armed violence and insecurity have a destructive effect on a country's development, often resulting in long-standing disputes crossing generations. So the rule of law and justice systems must be reinforced to protect the most vulnerable populations from all forms of violence, human trafficking, and exploitation. Agenda 2030 calls for a robust and participative accountability framework at the global, regional, and national levels. Member states are encouraged to make the best use of existing mechanisms for follow-up and review of the implementation of the goals and targets, including the participation of civil society organizations and other stakeholders. This is so important because in so many countries, civil society is kept way outside and often seen as the enemies of government. So to conclude, let me enumerate some points that are key to promote new and existing synergies between ICL and the human rights movement. So I have a long list here. One, both ICL and SDG 16 seek to promote human rights protection. ICL ensures that gross human rights violations, which amount to the 4 core international crimes, are investigated and prosecuted, and SDG 16 ensures human rights protection through some of its targets. Both serve the value of promoting peace, security, and development for the world. 2, conflict prevention through ICL. ICL provides a good legal framework to prohibit the waging of aggressive war, regulate the conduct of warring parties, and to enforce breaches of these rules. 3, ICL as a tool for promoting the rule of law. One of the targets of SDG 16 is, I quote, to promote the rule of law at the national and international level for all. ICL is the means by which this target can be achieved, namely accountability for perpetrators of international crimes. 4, ICL provides the means to develop effective, accountable, and transparent judicial institutions at the national level through cooperation with international criminal institutions, with capacity building programs, and complementarity to investigate and conduct genuine prosecutions for core international crimes. 5, ICL provides access to justice for victims of core international crimes. This is a key avenue to meet SDG 16 target of promoting access to justice for all. 6, provision of access to remedies to victims through ICL. The ICL system of providing reparations is a good precedent to advance the target of access to justice and reparation for victims. 7, general protection of vulnerable groups. A key aspect of promoting and enforcing non-discriminatory laws and policies, which is the target of SDG 16, is to protect the vulnerable. ICL provides remedies against high-level perpetrators of discrimination, exploitation, and destruction of vulnerable communities. 8, the protection of human rights defenders. The first target of SDG 16 is to, quote, to significantly reduce all forms of violence and related death rates everywhere. Human rights defenders suffer violence and death in their dangerous work of documenting and exposing violators. Here I include journalists as well. ICL prosecution of perpetrators offers protection for human rights defenders. So that would be a list of 8. I'm sure that there are many more. This conference and all of you, I'm very sure, will identify the elements of ICL that would be able to contribute to the advancement of the UN Agenda 2030 from 3 aspects: access to justice, access to remedies, and the role of human rights defenders. Thank you very much.